Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast. I'm Philip Ideson, a 20-year procurement practitioner, former head of procurement, advisor to procurement leaders around the world, and the founder and managing director of Art of Procurement. My team and I work with our global network of subject matter experts to help companies elevate procurement's impact, whether that's through building and implementing transformation programs, sustainably reducing external expenses, or leveraging AOP Mastermind, our learning and development platform for companies of all sizes. You're listening to our flagship podcast, where we pull back the curtain and shine a light on the strategies, tactics, and tools that leading procurement teams are using to align their results with the needs of the business. A few weeks ago, we hosted an AOP Live webinar with two long-time friends of the show, Chris Sawchuk, Principal and Global Procurement Advisory Practice Leader at the Hackett Group, and Vishal Patel, VP of Product Marketing at Ivalua. The topic of the webinar was to consider post-crisis procurement. We reviewed the performance of procurement throughout the spring and summer of 2020, discussed the transition from mid-crisis to post-crisis, and then the actions that we can take to position ourselves for success in 2021 and beyond. We really had a great webinar. We had over 500 registered attendees, and it was built around more than 50 questions that we received from registrants in advance. And so, as always, I start off by asking Chris and Vishal to both share how they got their start in procurement, and my question was first posed to Vishal.
Yeah, hi Phil, hi everyone, thanks for joining. So answer to that question is, I think that procurement chose me. One of my first jobs was actually working with my father, and he has his own business, but it's the business was in a developing country. And for anyone who's been in a business in a developing country, like a lot of the focus is on buying better.
Yeah.
Because you have to rely so much on suppliers that are from other countries and you're buying from abroad, right? So a lot of your competitive advantage is on buying better, and you actually, can make your whole business by selecting the right suppliers to work with and buying better. And so it was from a very, very early age that I was kind of exposed to the supply chain and procurement world. So yeah, I think it kind of chose me.
And Chris, how about yourself?
Yeah, well, it's definitely it chose me. I think if people look at my history, my dad, spent his entire career in procurement, and being the obstinate son, I would say that the one thing I said I would never do is get involved in procurement or anything that had to do with supply management, primarily because my dad did that. And so when I came out of school, I came out as an engineer. And so I spent my first, couple of years with IBM and United Technologies in engineering, and I was involved with procurement, as being an engineer. And then in IBM, I moved into sales and marketing. But then when I was at IBM, I was always exposed to these individuals coming in and, more or less in the consulting field. And I said, I'd like to do something different. I'd like to go out in that consulting field. And it just so happens that when I went out into that field, and the company that I joined, they started me off in a strategic sourcing project. Mm-hmm. And so in some ways it chose me, and that sort of started me off on the path that I continue on today.
It's always an interesting kind of question to ask the backstory, because so many of us found ourselves in procurement, and hopefully as a profession, we're seeing that more and more people are selecting it as a career path. But I think for a lot of us, myself included, didn't really know what I was getting myself in for, and then fell in love, once you started working in the profession.
But I will say, Phil, one of the things, my son has actually chosen it. He's going to the University of South Florida right now, and his major is in supply chain. So he's, I guess it skips generation.
You couldn't talk him out of it.
Yeah.
So I want to come, I'm going to ask you, Chris, the first question that we have. And the question is from Dennis and Camilla, both asked something similar. And we had a few questions along those lines. Before we discussed post-crisis era, which is one of the focuses of the webinar today, there's a question about describing kind of the crisis procurement era. And it's really a
Yeah.
three-part kind of question. And the questions that Dennis and Camilla are asking is kind of what were the initial requests that you saw that were made on procurement? How did we react to that? And did you see any interesting ways that our success was measured?
Yeah. Well, I think, everyone knows is probably one of the biggest things that changed was the criticality of PPE. As we went through this environment, we had situations where companies were being, some of their manufacturing plants were being shut down because they did not have access to some of the supplies. One particular example, you had an organization that had multiple plants around the United States, and their plants were operating in Texas, but because the requirements for PPE were different in California, and they didn't have access to the additional PPE they needed, they were not able to operate that plant. More than that, when the stuff that they had on order was actually being, rerouted to the government, and so that really was the first thing that sort of we had to deal with. But along with that is just the assurance of supply. And in the beginning it was all out of China, and just the constraints that we were having. So those are the types of things that really were constraining us right out of the gate in the crisis. The last piece of that question were around in terms of how was success being measured. I think people were looked at the ability to respond as a way to to be able to say, was I successful or not? Was I able to pivot quickly enough and have the agility as an organization to respond very quickly? And certainly there was disparities that we saw between organizations that were able to do that and those that were not able to do that.
Yeah, I'd love to a little bit later kind of dig into that a little bit of what was some of the reasons why those could respond positively versus those that struggled a little bit more. But I want to ask as well to Vishal, you obviously see a lot of procurement organizations, you're seeing the way that they're interacting with their technology stack as well. And did you see that change? And was technology a driver in how companies were able to react? Or how did companies kind of interact with technology as they had these new requirements?
Yeah, I think in a lot of ways, technology helped to respond better, right? But in some ways, and there's a couple of examples we can get into later, but in a lot of ways, the things that the procurement team had done before in terms of their digital transformation initiative or their automation of certain processes that just helped them better respond to the accelerated nature of what was required by the business, right? So in some extreme examples, it was actually something that was taken from being completely manual and paper-based, and this is actually like a public sector thing that suppliers were required to drop in a physically filled out form, like actual paper forms, into a mailbox of a public entity. And as COVID hit, they weren't able to do that for any new bids or new vendors, right? So they weren't able to do that. And so they accelerated their agenda to bring on a supplier portal and did that in a week and, delivered and deployed it in 2 weeks. And that was probably the fastest anyone's ever done anything like that. And so that was the reaction that it brought about. So in some cases, it accelerated things. In some cases, it just brought to the limelight a lot of the things that procurement teams had already done and maybe were really not getting that well noticed, right? But because there's only certain things that get noticed that procurement, it's only when you're involved in it that you notice what's kind of happening. But when you can't access your VPN or you don't have a laptop at home, then that's when you notice what procurement is able to do for your business.
Now, I have a question from Nancy. I'm going to ask you this, Chris. Nancy also references that she hates the term the new normal, and I think we're all kind of fatigued with talking about the new normal, but then also searching for ways to describe the situation that we're in right now. But Nancy's question is, like, in hindsight, what should we have done differently during the crisis?
Yeah, I think there's and again, it's you could say whether it was during the crisis what we should have done differently or before the crisis. And I think the crisis itself, I like to say, was the great stress test. it exposed a lot of vulnerabilities, in our companies, certainly in our supply chains, et cetera. And so if we have been going down a path of, digital transformation, et cetera, this environment, and sometimes we don't get opportunities to really stress test things. It's stress tested. How well are we doing? And I think it also exposed the disparities between companies that have done more than others. And you saw the ability they were able to react more quickly, especially around risk and just visibility to where their suppliers were, et cetera. And so we saw disparities around that. So, if I was to be asked, what would I have done differently? It's being more prepared. Mm-hmm. And it's not during the crisis as much, because, once you're in the crisis, it's sort of like, I had organizations telling me that, we wish we had more visibility into not only our tier 1 suppliers, but tier 2 and tier 3. Well, during the crisis, you're not going to get that visibility. Okay. Yeah. This is something that we had to do a long time ago. If we were going to try to, during the crisis, when we were exposed, we were constrained. Where were those constraints coming from? There's not much you can do then. And so, as much as it's difficult, and to me, this was a black swan event. It's a risk, and it's this age-old problem of really trying to balance. What do I invest in preparing for these types of things, versus not. And I think it certainly exposed that, and we'll talk further about this. But risk is certainly elevated on the agenda of not only procurement executives but companies in general.
Yeah, it's one of those topics that it doesn't have an ROI until a big event happens. And then you're always looking backwards thinking, I wish I'd have invested more in that.
Right.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you the same question, Chris. I'm going to ask you, Vishal, are you seeing that in your conversation with procurement leaders that risk is, it seems silly that we're still in the middle of this pandemic to me talking about it in the back kind of rear view mirror, but people forget easily. Do you still see that risk is top of the agenda or towards the top of the agenda, that it's not being forgotten as we're getting into this new normal? Because that's one of the things I'm the most afraid of.
Yeah, no, it's still, I think it's still top of the agenda, or very high at least. And actually, Chris, the point you made about having visibility into multiple tiers of your supply chain, that's actually something that, one of our more advanced customers, we worked together with them on before the crisis even. And ever since we launched that capability, it's been, one of those things where people see it and they're like, oh my goodness, if I had this view, or if I knew who my suppliers were, or if I knew who the subcontractors are for my suppliers, there are many things I could have done. So to answer that question, right? Like, what if you have that visibility, there may have been things you could have done, but without it, you're kind of blind. But then the other aspect of like, what could we have done differently? I feel like there's an element of procurement's function that has to probably do a lot with just continuously building relationships with suppliers, right? And I think that the relationships that are going to survive the pandemic and get stronger, or become more collaborative and help sort of each other as buyer and supplier are the ones which will help you through the crisis, right? So it's not when you're in crisis, you can't go and squeeze your supplier. You have to help them, because that's you'll get it back when the next time it comes around, right? So I feel like there's a bit of that as well, and the companies that had been doing that and had a good process and program for that probably were receiving them back. We're kind of getting that paid back to them during this crisis.
Yeah, Phil, just another comment, and you spurred some other ideas, Vishal. I made the comment of being prepared, and Vishal, you made the comment of having those relationships. We talked about having the visibility to multi-tiers, et cetera. These are capabilities that we had to build ahead of time. But we even saw things like organizational structure and being able to respond more quickly. I'll give you an example. I had an organization that was, considering, moving to a more decentralized type of organizational structure. One that, they were more of a center-led organization, but they were looking to move, more of the procurement, activity out to the businesses. And, this was just before the crisis hit. As we went through the crisis, not only did they, squash that idea, but they've more solidified the fact that they needed a more centered structure based on the fact of how they're able to react much more quickly and with more agility than if they had been decentered, and the coordination that they had and the ability of how they certainly responded.
Would you say that that's that you're seeing more of that? Because there has been a bit of a push to go from, it's funny how we all went to a centralized and center-led to perhaps being more decentralized, which is more now technology enabled.
Yeah.
Now, would you say that that's a one-off, that organization kind of put the brakes on going to decentralized, or that you're seeing more organizations think, should we really be devolving some responsibility back into the business, or should we put the brakes on that?
Well, I think there's a couple of things. I do believe that what we want are the benefits that you can get out of a more coordinated, centralized type of structure. The question is can I do that in an environment where I put some of that activity back out into the business? And what the dependency there is the technology, as you mentioned. If I have that, then moving it more out to the business. At the end of the day, it is a hybrid structure. There will never be a fully centered or a fully decentered organization. It is a hybrid, and the real question is, where do you draw that line? And there's a number of factors that help you do that. One of them is the level of automation that you have as an organization.
So I want to move on to the last question on this first topic, and this is from Chris. Chris was asking if you have seen, and I'll open with Vishal and then pass to Chris, if you've seen any kind of tangible evidence that procurement really has achieved a step-changing recognition among the C-suite because of our response, and because of the increasing need for procurement during the pandemic.
I mean, I think we've heard from a couple of our customers where they were definitely better prepared, more reactive, and didn't suffer as much in terms of comparing to peers that weren't in as bad a state. And it's really this one example is in the healthcare vertical. So things in the US, they kind of started in New York and spread elsewhere, but this one customer of ours, which is Baylor Scott and White, actually they went through a big effort to build more relationships directly with suppliers. So more self-contracting, more self-distribution, which if in healthcare in the US, the model has kind of left health systems a little bit disconnected from their own supply chain, right? Because of various methods and various processes that they had before. And so many organizations are looking to bring back the relationships, the direct relationships with suppliers, be more in control of their supply chain. And so because they had gone through that, they were much better prepared and were able to, have stocks of PPE, and were able to, respond better to their, multi-hospital system. And as a result, they were, it was certainly recognized that, hey, procurement, supply chain in the healthcare world was recognized for having achieved that, right, and having been reactive to that. And without that, so I asked this question to them once, like, if you didn't do all this, what would have happened? And yeah, the answer was we would have, kind of suffered a lot, like many other healthcare systems did. So that was one really good example that we came across.
Chris, just wondering if you're seeing that as well, that kind of tangible examples of procurement being in that elevated role because of our response to the pandemic.
Yeah, I think it's certainly been an opportunity, and some of the things that we have seen, not only as a result of the pandemic, but other things that have risen to a national discussion as of late, that these topics of supply risk are now not only executive discussions or executive committee level discussions. There are leaders of procurement, clients of mine, that are actually participating in board meetings around supply risk. That wasn't happening before. If it was a very low level. And what we're seeing that on a much more broader basis. And so, when you really start to understand the impact that supply and supply chain can have on the the profitability and the success of our companies, this really becomes elevated to that level. So yeah, I think, depending on, I think the conversation has been elevated. The question is, and to your point is, will procurement be elevated as well? And it's really going to come down to how well does it respond and develop these capabilities. But yeah, the opportunity is significant, and it is there.
Yeah, you talk about supply risk. I know from my personal experience, I had the opportunity to build a third-party risk management program, and the challenge was always getting people to care. You can build the structure and the process, and you can have the technology that underpins it. But at the end of the day, taking proactive mitigation costs money, and it costs money to the stakeholder and the budget holder. And most of the time, they were happy to take the risk. So just if it, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
I was going to say, it's funny that you bring that up. If you don't know, I'm working on my doctorate right now. And I'm as you do that, you start trying to determine topics for your dissertation. Well, I'm far from starting my dissertation, but one of the things I focused on in some of my classes is some topics I've been toying around with, and it's exactly what you're talking about. Is this trade-off between the investment in risk and the benefits. You got benefits that are hard to quantify. And I always use the analogy, sort of like buying insurance. I live here in Florida and near the water. And so you sit there and you buy insurance. And then one of the decisions you have to make is, how much deductible do I want? Well, if I knew that nothing was going to happen, I'd have the highest deductible. But I don't know that. So you lower, and then nothing happens for 5 years. And so, well, I should have taken the higher deductible. And these are the challenges that we have. And the other thing I see, I've seen organizations go build risk capabilities, very robust risk capabilities, only to find 5 years later dismantling them, because as we get farther and farther from the event that caused us to go build those capabilities, we have short-term memories. And then people start questioning, well, why are we investing in this? Why are all these resources tied up in this, et cetera, based on what's happening? I do believe that the pandemic, this crisis, is different, because it's not, singular. It's not a company or a couple of companies. This is a pandemic that impacts us all. And I think, what we will see is, much more momentum behind building these capabilities and less reliance on the fact that we have to cost justify it. And then we'll get in a mindset that, we have to have this regardless. It's the cost of doing business. And that we'll see more investments going forward.
Well, I have, and actually, I just want to pause just to encourage anybody to jump in with any questions that you might have as we're going through our conversation with Chris and Vishal. Kelly is keeping an eye on the Q&A button or the Q&A kind of panel where you have the opportunity to do that. So please keep any questions coming in. I'm going to come over to Kelly in a couple of moments. But I have a question. You're talking about investment. You're talking about it from a risk perspective, but one of the questions that came in as we're thinking about what does this mean for procurement going forward, and it's a question that was asked really both by Matthias and Ricardo. And essentially the question is, like, much is currently discussed from changes that the post-pandemic scenario require from supply chain management in general. What changes do you see in procurement and sourcing in terms of the operating models? Models like category management, whether we look in-house or outsourced. We talked a little bit about centralized versus decentralized. Is the pandemic alone going to change how people are thinking about organization structure in procurement, or is it more because of the economy and the financial health of our companies that may be driving some of those changes?
Do you want me to take that one?
Yeah, I'll throw that to you, Chris, first.
Okay. It's an interesting question. I think, the question of, operating model design and organizational design, is been a, question that we continue to go back and forth. I mean, we were just having a little bit of a discussion around centered versus decentered, and, the pendulum swings there as well. And, again, there's benefits to each of these models. And the question is, how do I take the benefits of these models and creating an operating model that gives me the benefits in more centered or decentered, kind of, structure, within my company. I think, you mentioned category management, and I think, category management, the impact of the crisis in terms of our thinking about category management. Category management is one of those things, and I remember writing a paper with our team a number of years ago, just trying to help organizations understand the difference between strategic sourcing and category management. And really, it's sourcing versus strategic sourcing to category management. And that, as we look forward in category management, my perspective is that, how the crisis has impacted that is that we will, use it as an opportunity to plan more effectively. I think, what we saw was that planning and being prepared, allowed us to react to an event. I call it a black swan event. We don't know that nobody was sitting there and, nobody had contingency plans based on a pandemic. They had them based on hurricanes and, other kinds of, disasters that might occur. And so we were adopting those models and contingency plans for the pandemic. But I think, what we will see is that priorities will change. And so as we think about a good category manager, will risk become more of a factor in my decisions in terms of how I might architect a supply base? Because, much of how we've architected things has been prioritized more on cost than on other areas. I mean, part of the reason that we're in China, not only because of cost, but originally that was the reason, but also because of capabilities now. But what you're seeing is, more of a shine highlighted is that we have to consider, things like risk and agility within our supply chains going forward. It may increase our cost a bit. And that's why you're seeing, some of the, changes in supply chains in terms of the diversification. How do we, diversify our supply chain out of China? Not leave China, but, can I also look at, other markets to participate in at the same time, closer to my home markets where I'm selling, and, potentially give myself a little bit more velocity. So there's going to be other considerations in our design going forward. And to me, that's what the crisis is really helping to accelerate in the current environment.
Vishal, I want to kind of go on the same line. We talk about changes in, how we're changing the structure, for example, of procurement as well to be more adaptive to these new challenges. Obviously, technology plays a big part in that. Have you seen that there's been certain elements of technology that clients, prospects, just generally CPOs, procurement leaders that you talk to have gravitated towards because they see that it's this is a good area of quick investment, it's going to drive me a quick ROI, and maybe I'll focus on that part of my technology stack versus another? And has there been kind of any consistency in that?
Yeah, I guess it differs depending on how mature your procurement organization is. There's certainly been more of an interest or desire to take on smaller chunks of technology and achieve quick wins that you can build upon and evolve into something bigger. So that's one theme. And for example, we've introduced some jumpstart packages, we call them. So they're sort of lower cost, faster deployment, and within a short time you can achieve some quick value that you can build upon. So that's one area. I mentioned the multi-tier risk. That's certainly been an area which important also not just for manufacturing organizations, oddly enough, even for financial service organizations, which now it's becoming a bigger deal where the whole KYS, know your supplier thing is now not know your supplier, but know your supplier's supplier, and subcontractors, and all these regulations around outsourcing and the European banking regulations. So all of those things are landing on procurement's desk, right, in some way, shape, and they're being asked to figure out how are we going to address. So how do we figure out this, all of our outsourced relationships and build contingencies and understand the reliance we have on them? Like, where do we begin? And those are some of the things that are being asked. And typically, it's you think about multi-tier, it's for manufacturers, but definitely also for financial services as well. Yeah, I think those are the main ones. I think contracts has been an interesting one as well, because procurements, they have had to figure out what their obligations and what are their obligations, what are their terms in their contracts with some suppliers, and basically not having that in an easy way to find and search and access. So obviously that poses lots of challenges. So that's been an area of focus as well. I'd say those are some of those. Yeah.
I'm actually encouraged to hear when you talked about, looking at tier 2, tier 3 suppliers in financial services. Financial services always, manufacturing leads the way because of physical supply chains, but what is often missed is that there's as much risk in a virtual supply chain as a physical one. And a virtual one, I mean, for a service, for example, because you still have, a building that needs to operate that may be in a flood zone, or you need the ability for people to get from the office to the call center. And a lot of the kind of cybersecurity risks that are introduced there. So financial services kind of leads the way when it comes to that because of the regulatory requirements. But definitely always encourage folks who are in non-manufacturing businesses not to think that risk only really applies when you're moving physical product. It applies as much when you're buying services.
Yep.
Kelly, I want to just jump over to you and see if there's any questions that have come in so far.
There are, as a matter of fact, and actually this first one, I suspect that this is going to be both the most critical question and the most important answer to come out of today's hour. Vishal, Grace would like to know where you got your T-shirt.
This is an Ivalua T-shirt, so it's like a bit of a marketing campaign we've continuously running actually. Well, we started it 2 years ago at our annual conference, and we kind of had this thought, like, you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but whenever I talk to procurement people, you get the sense that they really do love procurement. Not just like, hey, yeah, I'm in procurement, I like it, but they actually do enjoy it. So we had this idea to collect some actual quotes from procurement, like why, and the question was simple, like, do you love procurement? If you do, why? And we got all these answers that were really phenomenal, and we actually have them on our website, but we made them into little quote cards. And procurement is one of my favorite was like, I don't source goods and services, I source relationships. So that was like it's a different way to think about things, right? So we got so many of those that we turned it into this love procurement campaign, and we should figure out a way to, I guess, get people some of these T-shirts.
You may be in the wrong business, as a matter of fact. Mark has seconded Grace's thoughts and thinks everyone that showed up today should get one.
I agree.
But circling us back to the topic at hand, Vishal, let me stay with you for just a second, because we've actually had a number of people inquire about this, although Gareth has just typed something into the question box. They're wondering, we've talked about change, and we've talked about risk, and we've talked about planning, and we've talked certainly about the impact of the crisis. But one thing that people seem very concerned about is the future viability of investment programs into sustainability and CSR. Do you think that those types of programs, whether they look like we think of them today, or whether they have to change a little bit to last into the future, what sorts of shifts do you think we're likely to see in those programs?
Yeah, this is an interesting one. I kind of thought a little bit about this actually, and one of my thought processes was that I think the pandemic has put us at a kind of like a fork in the road, right? Where you decide, do you just kind of, maybe you had some sustainability initiatives before, and now priorities have changed, so you kind of give up on those and go back to kind of basics, right? Like focus on savings, focus on categories, focus on the things that procurement is doing, and sustainability is kind of back in the background. Or do you take this opportunity to really think about the impact of your spend and how it can impact not only your business but the entire sort of ecosystem around you, right? Because every company does have their own spend, and the way they choose to navigate it and orchestrate it is going to have ramifications, right? And one of those, of course, is sustainability. And we see this a lot, like in the I don't know, in the U.S. public sector, the U.S. financial services sector, they're doing a lot around like diversity spend, right? We hear a lot about that. Those things are continuing because it's sort of high profile and people are reporting numbers and things like that. But when it comes to sustainability, I've definitely noticed that at least from our customer base, the European organizations are much more advanced in their sustainability agenda, and sort of formalizing that and actually tracking that, and it's a lot to do with regulation, right? A lot of that is to do with the country-based regulations, and I think it kind of depends in the US on sort of company policies or the code of ethics, right? Like Apple is doing a huge amount on sustainability, but many other manufacturers, many other billion-dollar manufacturers are not. So, I think for those guys, it would take a regulatory change to actually make a big investment in improving on the sustainability agenda. For others, I think the pandemic has shown like, hey, that what kind of business, it kind of takes you back to the reason of being in some way. Like, why are we in business? Yes, it's to make money, but shouldn't we be in business to kind of, I kind of look at the balance between, I don't know who it was, but we talk about the balance between economy, society, and environment, right? And the balance has always been more on economy and less on society, environment, and it should be more balanced. But I think that there are those businesses that will take this opportunity, I think, to rebalance. At least I hope so.
Any thoughts that you want to add to that, Chris, from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, this is, it's interesting because you're right. I mean, we've been talking about the crisis, and that sort of shifted our focus in a number of areas that we've highlighted. But then I would say in the last couple of months, there's this other social discussion that we're having as organizations, and specifically around diversity. But what we're seeing is that that there is this whole bringing together of this corporate social responsibility that we can have an impact on, and from a supply perspective, whether it be ethical sourcing, whether it be environment, or whether it be diversification, and these things are coming together. I made the comment earlier that supply risk has become a board level discussion, an active board level discussion in many companies. Well, at the same time, this is also hitting supply, that supply diversity has become, and diversification has become a board level discussion as well. And, I know one of the questions you asked earlier, Phil, was around, procurement and where do we see us going in the future? Well, I just mentioned two areas that are becoming, that have become board level discussions, and we're right in the middle of those. And so we have certainly opportunities to really, take advantage of these periods of time and not only do some good within our supply chains, but also social good as well. I think it's we're at the sort of the forefront. The conversations, we've been studying diversity since 2005, and we do every so year study. We got a sustainability study coming up, in the next month. And what's interesting is that the number of discussions, because I think what we're going to see is we're going to see a forcing of a new activity going on in our country, because for a long time diversity in particular was a reporting game. Not all organizations. There's a lot that we're doing it for other reasons, but there's a lot of reasons why it's been successful in some companies and not in others. But there is a large majority that this has been a reporting exercise that they've been involved in, and it's just happenstance whatever their numbers come out to be. What you're seeing now is all the proactiveness and driving this. I think the challenge is going to be is that if you look at all of these companies out there, and if they all try to diversify at a similar level, there may not be enough business to go around to satisfy those requirements those organizations want to get to, which is going to force the second piece, which we don't normally get to, and that's development. You're going to see moving from a reporting exercise to one that we're actually developing suppliers to augment them, to develop adjacencies, to the capabilities that they have today. And to me, that's the whole point of why we go focus on these areas, is really to develop businesses, and then specifically develop some of these diverse businesses.
No, and that's so incredibly interesting. And actually, as you make that point about investing in supplier development, it also brings up the question of looking back at risk management and considering how quickly we can do any of this and how much spend we can actually bring under management. And Donna has made an excellent point here in the event chat, where she talks about, sometimes sourcing cycles can be many, many months long already, but that there's an expectation that we will be agile, right, which requires us to either shorten cycle times or speed up decision making, more access to real-time information, and yet these highly relational development-based activities take time. Do you think there's going to be some amount of tension that exists between the speed of business and the agility that our companies expect of us with the natural lead time and ramp up associated with really thorough, lasting development?
I can go first. Yeah, there's going to be tension, but to me, it's going to be good tension. I think one of the studies that we did back in May, it was focused on supply and demand. Really, trying to understand the way that organizations responded, both from supply and demand standpoint during the crisis and what they thought going forward. And one of the questions that we asked was, as you look at digital transformation within our organizations, do you believe that we will see that increase on a go forward, decrease, stay about the same, et cetera? 77% of the organizations said that their digital transformation efforts would moderately or highly accelerate going forward. For us to do some of these things, and understanding that we got this tension in an organization where we potentially want to broaden our supply chain, which may add cost. We want to be more socially conscious, et cetera. These are competing conflicts. At the same time, we know that we have to be faster. We have to develop a clock speed in our organizations that's much faster than we have to respond to market opportunities, et cetera. It's the whole focus on velocity. And so we don't have a choice other than to become more digital in the way we do things to be able to go do that. And so I think it's a forcing event to really drive, and you see that. I mean, it's happening now as we speak. To go forward, that will give us the opportunity to go focus on some of these other areas that do take additional time. To your point, Kelly.
Yeah, if I can just add, I think on the topic of supplier development, like there's a report we just recently promoted, we posted from Gartner. Actually, it was on managing or maintaining supplier monitoring financial risk of suppliers, right? And obviously that's sort of a basic procurement activity. You monitor financial health of your suppliers. And usually you're looking at financial health and seeing like, hey, if they're in trouble, then maybe we need to find a new supplier. But, I guess it's more of a question for me even is, did people question themselves more like, hey, supplier looks like they're in trouble. Do we need to help them during this time, versus try to get rid of them during this time? And so it kind of, that kind of circles back to this supply development question, I think.
All right, Kelly, I know that there's some others that are coming in, so I'm going to ask a couple more questions on our last topic, and I'll come back to you, Kelly, for any that we have to wrap up. So I want to move on, and thank you, Chris and Vishal, for answering some of those questions that came in. We're getting a lot of really cool questions that are coming in, and I know we've got 10-15 minutes left of the conversation. So I want to pivot towards positioning for future success. And I'm actually going to ask a variant of the question that I had from Ratri. I'm going to ask it to you, Vishal, first, because I'm going to ask it more with a technology perspective before I come over to Chris. The question is about priorities for CPOs post-crisis, knowing that budgets are getting tight. And there's something you said earlier about when CPOs and executives are looking at technology, they're looking for quick wins. So I guess kind of my question there, because it drives what some of the priorities are, is what kind of quick wins are they looking for? What are people coming to you saying, I need to be able to do this, I need to be able to do it quickly?
I mean, it does range. It's from just moving from more manual sourcing activities to having an automated system in place so that they're able to execute more on the same resources. So it's sort of, at some level, it's as simple as that, I guess. But some more complex cases are, I know, like in a couple cases where cash management is becoming a bit of an issue, where now procurement's been asked, like, hey, how do we manage the process of capturing discounts from suppliers if they're offering, right? Like, so this is probably a good example of where suppliers can really benefit from money faster. And is there a way to automate that or make it more efficient without throwing people at the problem, right? So I think those are a couple of the areas, but yeah.
And Chris, I want to position it to you. I know that you do a lot of work at Hackett on key issues, and you have your key issue study. And throughout that study, you're always talking about priorities of CPOs. Are you seeing that that's changed materially over the last 6 months or so? Or is it more being, we're kind of focusing on the things we've always focused on? What are you seeing from a priorities perspective?
I would say it's both. And, coming into into 2020 at the tail end of, 2019, we asked that question, what are your top priorities? And, not surprisingly, what we see is, cost and, cost savings is, is always up there on the list, nothing surprising there. But risk was not even in the top 10, supply risk. And I think if I went out to anybody right now, and we didn't redo the study or et cetera, but just based on the conversations we're having, the conversation we're having today, risk is probably in the top 5 for most organizations right now. And so, the priorities have changed. Some of them have stayed the same. Cost is still a focus. And, in some ways, it's become more important to some organizations, even more important than it was at the tail end of last year. But, digital, we've seen an acceleration. I have organizations that, had say, hey, we're not going to do anything on digital. Understand a lot of things are going on. We're coming into the tail end of last year, and, we have it, but, we're going to look at that, 2021. We're going to look at a new platform, et cetera. You talk to them in June, guess what? It's now on their priority list. They're doing it now. Yeah. So that certainly has accelerated. So digital, the focus on cost. But when I say the digital, the other, the other side of that is we got to bring along our talent as well. And so, talent becomes another priority, and specifically around technology, around data, around analytics. Those types of skills is where we have the biggest gaps within the talent in our organization. CSR, again, something that has, become very visible within our organization. So how do we focus on our social responsibility through supply? And then lastly, what we've been talking about a lot is the whole area around risk. So, to me, those are the 5 priorities that, you look at most organizations, they would be, close to the top of, where they're focusing.
So I'd love to know if you're seeing, something that I'm observing. You basically have an organization right now fits on one or the other side of a wall. One side of the wall is, oh dear, stronger language than that. We got to kind of save money quickly. We may even have an existential crisis, but our world changed for the worse. And the other side is, wow, everything's going like gangbusters now. We're suddenly thrust into high growth. We got to keep up with demand. And it feels to me that there's been no real time until now that there's been such a disparity between objectives within an organization. So whereas in procurement before, we used to look at, like you say, cost savings and supplier innovation and diversity and all the things that you kind of mentioned that all organizations were focusing on. Now it's like some don't care about some, and they're all over here and some are over there. And I mean, are you observing that as well, that it's so organizational specific right now of what's important because of the situation they find themselves in?
Yeah, I mean, you do find that, but for, I think some of these are just more broad issues like corporate social responsibility. I don't think that, again, there may be some variation there, but it's basically taken everyone and sort of, shifted it over to a higher priority for them. Cost, again, yes, it is situational. I think organizations are looking at costs as being important, but there are organizations out there that it's not that important to them.
Yeah.
Especially like you mentioned, some organizations are going through just significant high demand right now in several different industries. And, it's been more of an assurance of supply issue for them. How do we get access and assure our supply so we can take advantage of the revenue increase that we're having right now? And that's the most important thing. So they're, from a cost standpoint, they're not even focusing on it. They're not looking at, the cost. It's about assuring supply. And in many cases, there are situations where certain organizations are better prepared than others, and they're taking advantage of gaining market share because some of their competitors were not able to secure supply. Now, some of the ones that were able to secure supplies, they had the foresight. They saw what was happening in China. And as a result of that, they started building up inventories. Now, it was a risk because nothing ever happened and this pandemic didn't get as big as it did. They would have been sitting on a lot of inventory. But the bet paid off. In this particular case, the head of supply chain, sat down with the COO and the CEO, and they all said, yes, let's go do this. We think it's a good bet. And so everybody went in eyes wide open. But I do believe, those are the kinds of things. But there is a dichotomy, to your point, of those organizations that are dealing with significant demand and those that aren't. So, where that focuses is more on the type of risk we're dealing with. But when I look at the issues like, CSR, I look at, even the talent issues, even the digital issues, those are pretty common across everybody. Even though people are at different stages of their maturity.
Yeah, another area, as you were talking, just came up, just made me think about is, we focus a lot on solutions to help manage direct spend, which is, obviously for manufacturing more, but and in that sort of area where a lot of manufacturers are still managing and doing direct sourcing and doing planning and forecasting activities in a very manual way, or using basic sort of tools from their ERP systems. And we're finding that a lot of them are accelerating their needs to automate the direct sourcing portion, which is managing a bill of materials and managing, one of the key parts is actually communicating and collaborating with their suppliers on the forecasts and on the demand plans they have, and then being assured that they have the capacity to supply, right? And I think a lot of times those activities, which are really essential, are done on spreadsheets, which obviously limits your ability to be responsive.
Now, I want to stay with you, Vishal, for the last question that I have. We'll see if we have time just to go back to Kelly for one more, but it's a question that we received from Linda. Linda is asking, we talked about some of the priorities of procurement and how perhaps that's changing. Are some of the success metrics changing as well? Are you seeing in the real world, when you're having conversations, I think from your perspective, it's probably when you're talking business cases, are savings less important as they used to be?
I mean, from a business case standpoint, savings is always going to be one of the main sort of objectives, right? I mean, what amount of value can this procurement initiative generate for you, right? So savings, I think, is always going to be a key thing. I think a lot of metrics can revolve now around cycle time. So like, how fast are you able to get a new supplier on board? How fast are you able to execute a sourcing event? How efficient are you in managing your sourcing pipeline? Like those kind of metrics, and looking at resource availability and sort of execution of sourcing events and stuff like that. Yeah, I think other metrics that we hear about is supplier performance is one that's come up a lot in the context of risk, right? Like if you think about manufacturers, they're obviously monitoring supplier performance at a very, very granular level. They're measuring like quality and lead times and issues and exceptions and all this kind of stuff. And I think that's becoming more and more of a metric. Like I think before it was kind of like a, hey, nice to have, we'll kind of monitor our supplier performance. But now it's like, okay, as part of risk, in the context of the risk initiatives, I need to account for my suppliers' performance, and I need to know what I'm spending with them. I need to know where I'm reliant on them for parts and products. I need to know which of my businesses are reliant on those suppliers, how much risk do I have with them, and there's all these aspects which are now coming into play, which kind of actually a lot of it is around data and analytics, right? That you're able to get from across all of the procurement processes, and are you able to look at them in a way that can uncover certain things that you may not be able to see if they're all sort of siloed separately. If any of that made sense.
No, it does make sense, and it's interesting. Data obviously gives you that visibility that we may not have had before, but also how do you drive metrics that go from that look at risk, so that you actually have it's like a traffic light system or something, so you can start to see where your risks exist, so you know where you need to proactively go and look at monitoring and mitigating, which typically we struggled with because it's all run on spreadsheets and it's not dynamic. So it allows us to be a lot more real time in decision making.
Yeah, like one simple question is, do you know all of the activities, the total activities that you have with a given supplier? Like, can you tell like how many contracts they have, how much spend, how many transactions, what is their performance, what are the issues you have with them, where are their invoices? If you can answer that question well, like you're already in a good place. But
we have 60 seconds, Chris, so to put you on the spot in 60 seconds or less. What are you seeing from a metrics? Are folks looking for more of a balanced scorecard today than they were 6 months ago?
Yeah, absolutely. But I would just leave with a thought that it's all about enabling the business to be successful, and we're all different as companies. Our priorities are different, etc. And so, the risk scorecard ought to reflect the business priorities. And, if you had that alignment, you guys talked about supplier performance, if you have good supplier performance, drives procurement performance, drives business performance. And so you see that. And again, speed, revenue, there's other things that are changing, but it is about the alignment.
Yeah, no, I'd love to hear that. We champion that so much. Alignment with business objectives. You got to start there, and build your capability around that, and truly understanding what they are versus what you believe they are, because there's sometimes a big gap. I know it's time to wrap up, so I want to thank everybody first of all for joining us today. I want to thank Kelly online for engaging over the chat and answering and bringing some questions in. We had so many questions that we didn't get to, that I regret that we couldn't go on for another hour asking them, but I think Chris and Vishal probably need a break at this point. I want to thank Vishal and Chris for joining us the past hour, so thank you.